In this video, I'm going to be doing 5 things. I'm going to start by talking about the difference between a theory of right action and a theory of practical deliberation. Then we're going to talk about the golden rule. Then we'll talk about Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill's definitions and versions of utilitarianism. Then we'll do some Kantian ethics, and we'll finish off with some Aristotelian virtue ethics. Now, that's a lot. So my recommendation would not be to watch this video in one sitting. Watch a section, then go take a break, do something else, then come back and watch the next section, and so on. So let's get started. I'm going to start with a story. Now, a couple of weeks ago, my friend Gretchen and I were in Memphis, Tennessee. We were walking around, then we saw a man. He stumbled up to us. He was clutching a broken arm. When he got to us, he gasped, "Which way is the hospital?" Gretchen, my friend, without missing a beat, pointed to her left and said, "That way." Now, I was surprised by Gretchen's response, because neither she nor I had any experience whatsoever with the layout of Memphis. We were on our way to New Orleans from St. Louis, and Memphis was just a stop along our way. So I pulled out my phone just to verify, and I checked a map, and sure enough, there was a hospital 1 mile down the street that way, in exactly the way that Gretchen had pointed. So I asked her, I said, "How did you know?" She says, "How did I know what?" And I replied, "How did you know where the hospital was?" So what she said next truly shocked me. Now, although she sincerely wanted the man to get to the hospital, she did not know that there was a hospital down the street when she was giving him directions. And she went on to tell me that her method for figuring out where to send the man was to just point in a random direction. Now, I've known Gretchen for many years, so I wasn't surprised. But I was still kind of horrified, because although she had arrived at the right answer this time, her procedure for figuring out the right answer was deeply irresponsible. Let's take a step back and talk about the story that I just told you. Now, one question you can ask is, which direction should the injured man walk? And the answer is that the man should walk in whichever direction will actually lead him to the hospital. What determines the answer to that question is geography, and Gretchen got that question right. But another question we can ask is, how should we figure out which direction the injured man should walk in? And the answer to that question is that we should probably consult a map. Consulting a map is a reliable way of figuring out the geographical facts that determine which way the man should walk. Now, when we're doing ethics, we can ask 2 similar questions. So imagine that you're living in a universe with an omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent God. This is a being who is all-knowing, all-good, and all-powerful. Now, this God tells you that the morally correct action is whatever action leads to the greatest number of beautiful paintings in the world. So you now know that you should do whatever leads to the greatest number of beautiful paintings in the world. This is in many ways analogous to knowing that the injured man should go in whichever direction leads to the hospital. But just as you can know that he should head to the hospital without actually knowing which direction will lead to the hospital, you can know that you should do whatever leads to the greatest number of beautiful paintings in the world without actually knowing which action will actually lead to the greatest number of beautiful paintings in the world. So maybe donating to art galleries will lead to more beautiful paintings, but maybe donating to an organization that teaches art to school children will result in even more beautiful paintings. Whatever the right answer is, it would be irresponsible to simply guess, to pick whichever action seems the most fun, or to flip a coin. You need a better procedure for figuring out what the right path is. So at this point, I'm going to introduce a distinction. A theory of right action specifies the conditions under which an action is right, under which it is the right action to perform. A theory of practical deliberation tells you how to deliberate about, how to figure out which action is the right action to perform. So in the story I told you about the God, do whatever brings about the greatest number of beautiful paintings is a theory of right action. It gives you the conditions for an action's being the right action. But That theory of right action doesn't tell you how to figure out whether a given action will actually result in the greatest number of beautiful paintings. To do that, we also need a theory of practical deliberation. Now, I've already rejected 3 potential theories of practical deliberation: guessing, picking the action that seems the most fun, and flipping the coin. And I rejected them because I have no good reasons to believe that the actions that I select via guessing, the actions that seem the most fun to me, or the actions that win in a competition of coin flips will be the actions that bring about the greatest number of beautiful paintings. These are all unreliable guides to figuring out the relationship between an action and the number of beautiful paintings that action will produce. So here's a more reliable theory of practical deliberation. Hire some social scientists to conduct experiments that examine the relationship between a variety of interventions and the quality of beautiful paintings, the quantity and the quality of beautiful paintings produced by those affected by the interventions. Now, I'm not saying that this is actually the correct theory of practical deliberation. Instead, I'm just giving you an example of how to search for a theory of practical deliberation. You should evaluate different ways of deliberating, based in part on how reliable that way of deliberation is. Reliability isn't the only criterion that matters, but it's certainly one of the most important criteria. Now, over the course of this week, we're going to be looking at several ethical theories. And while you study these theories, I want you to be careful to distinguish between theories of practical deliberation and theories of right action. All of these theories will contain an element of both. And as we're going to explore, a single theory of right action can be compatible with a variety of theories of practical deliberation. All right, so that was a discussion of the difference between theories of practical deliberation and theories of right action. Let's now talk about the golden rule. Now, my friend Gretchen, who I introduced in the last video, has a unique hobby. She walks into stores, finds the most expensive item that isn't bolted down to the floor, and then absconds with it. She's a serial shoplifter who will steal from any shop she finds herself in without any regard to the impacts of her choices on others. Now, about a month ago, Gretchen and I were meeting up for a drink in a socially distanced outside bar, and I could tell that she'd been having a rough day. So I asked her, "What's wrong?" Now, Gretchen runs a business selling essential oils, and apparently one of her customers had, earlier that day, stolen $50 of her merchandise. Now, I was a bit confused because just yesterday she had texted me, or just the day before, she had texted me a picture of a new pair of earrings that she had stolen. So I said, "Gretchen, don't you think it's, inconsistent of you to be upset that someone has stolen from you when you steal from other people all the time, including just yesterday?" So she responded by telling me that she didn't understand what I meant. She didn't think there was anything wrong with taking the earrings because she wanted them. But she was really upset because she wanted to sell the essential oils. Also, she added that I was being a bad friend. She dumped her drink on my head and she walked off. Now, the moral principle we're going to explore in this video is called the golden rule. And when I say the golden rule, I'm talking about a very specific principle that the philosopher Thomas Carson described in his work on deception in professional ethics. He described it as follows, and I quote, "Consistency requires that if I think it would be morally permissible for someone to do a certain act to another person, then I must not object to someone doing that same act to me in relevantly similar circumstances." Now, the golden rule helps make sense of my criticism of Gretchen's behavior. She thinks it's morally permissible for her to perform the act of theft against someone else, but she doesn't think it's morally permissible for someone else to perform that act against her. She is thus being inconsistent. Now, I want you to note that stealing a pair of earrings from a small independent jeweler, as Gretchen did, is not the same thing as stealing a loaf of bread from a large bakery if you are at risk of starving to death. And that is why the golden rule is expressed in terms of relevantly similar circumstances. An impoverished father who steals a loaf of bread to feed his starving children does not act inconsistently when he objects to Gretchen's act of stealing his last $5 bill from his pocket so that she can go buy a larger latte from Starbucks. Those are not relevantly similar circumstances. So, thus, one way that we can criticize someone's conduct is by pointing to a lack of consistency among their judgments. If they judge that it is morally permissible for them or for their friends to pollute the environment of others who are too poor or disconnected from the levers of power to meaningfully object, then they are, by consistency alone, required to not object when they are being treated or at risk of being treated that way by others. This principle is a powerful principle, and it cuts across the political divide today. So your judgments are inconsistent if you silence the speech of others while objecting to their silencing of your speech. If you destroy the property of others during a protest for a just cause, if you object to the destruction of your own property in the pursuit of that same cause. If you think that it is permissible for the police to kill a person, if you would object to yourself being killed under similar circumstances, you are also being inconsistent. Now, in order to understand the golden rule as a moral principle, it needs to be the case that it's bad for someone's judgments to be mutually inconsistent. Or, to put it another way, inconsistency is a bad-making feature of a set of judgments. So, should we accept that consistency is a good thing and inconsistency is bad? Yes, we should. And we really don't have a choice in the matter, because consistency is a basic requirement for thinking about morality or any other intellectual or practical project at all. If you don't value consistency, then I really don't know what to tell you. There's not much you're going to be able to do. Anyway, once we see that consistency is a good-making feature of a set of judgments, we can represent the golden rule as a theory of right action. If I think that it would be morally permissible for someone to do a certain act to another person, then I must not object to someone doing that same act to me in relevantly similar circumstances. We have, thus, a theory of right action. But what is our theory of practical deliberation? Well, what we're looking for in a theory of practical deliberation is a decision-making procedure that will reliably lead us to perform the action that our theory of right action tells us to perform. In this case, we're looking for a decision-making procedure that will reliably lead us to have consistent judgments. And in particular, we're looking for a decision-making procedure that will reliably prevent us from judging that it's okay for us to do things to others when we would object if they did those same things to us. Now, one such procedure is to imagine that we are in another person's shoes. If we're contemplating stealing from someone, for example, we could ask, would I object if someone were to steal from me? Now, that procedure, that theory of practical deliberation, is a good starting place, but it's not enough. Suppose that I would like to steal from someone else, and I think, well, life is a brutal, competitive game. And if someone were to steal from me, I would understand that that's just how the game is played. Now, it's possible that I'm saying that because I'm looking for an excuse, any excuse to steal, and that my belief about what the other person's perspective is just isn't reliable. It's also possible that I'm better at putting myself in the shoes of other people who are similar to me, rather than in the shoes of people who are not similar to me. Maybe I'm excellent at imagining what it would be like to be a kindergarten teacher, but I'm bad at imagining what it would be like to be a kindergartner. So the theory of practical deliberation that says put yourself in someone else's shoes is not a perfect theory of practical deliberation. The procedure it recommends can lead to states of affairs where we engage in motivated reasoning, or states of affairs where we are incompetent at representing the perspectives of the individuals whose perspectives we seek to understand. Our theory of practical deliberation, thus, requires safeguards. One safeguard is to consult and spend time with those who have perspectives that differ from ours, so that we can do a better job of understanding how our conduct would appear from their perspectives. What other safeguards do we need? I'd recommend spending some time thinking about this question on your own. Talk to your classmates, or if you want, even in the comments below in this YouTube video. All right, welcome to part 3. Now, the other day, my friend Gretchen and I were taking a walk. Now, I had set aside $150 to donate to charities, and we were talking about what I should do with it. Gretchen wanted me to use the money to buy her a new pair of AirPods for her iPhone. Now, she had already tricked me into buying her a pair for her birthday the year before, but then she had lost them. And Gretchen's reason was that she would really enjoy the AirPods and that I should help people close to me before helping people who live far away. Now, I, on the other hand, was favoring the Against Malaria Foundation, which buys long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets for people in countries like Malawi. And I mentioned Malawi because in order to send a bed net to a child in Malawi, it doesn't cost that much. It costs like somewhere around $4.25. So my reason for doing this was that I thought I could do much more good by giving the money to that charity than by giving it to her. Now, there's something right about the idea that I should give the money to the Against Malaria Foundation rather than to Gretchen. And one moral theory that really directly supports this judgment is the subject of this part of the lecture. And that theory is utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism isn't actually a single moral theory. It's a family of moral theories. And roughly speaking, utilitarian theories say that the right action is one that brings about the greatest net utility. Now, utilitarians disagree with one another about the definition of utility. They also disagree about whether the right action is the one that actually brings about the most overall utility, or whether it's the one that is expected to bring about the most overall utility. In this video, I'm going to sidestep most of the debates within utilitarian thought and focus narrowly on the utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. I'm going to begin, though, by talking about some features that all utilitarian theories share. The first thing I'll mention is that all utilitarians tell us that whether an action is right depends on the amount of intrinsic value associated with that action. So to clarify what this means, let's distinguish between intrinsic value and extrinsic value. Something is extrinsically valuable if it is good because of how it is related to something else. Money is extrinsically valuable. It is good because I can buy things, like a camera or a microscope, that can increase my utility by allowing me to pursue the projects that I enjoy. Thus, money's goodness comes from its relationship to utility. But money isn't valuable in and of itself. The presence of a big stack of money doesn't by itself alone make the world a better place. For money to make my life better, I need to use it to get something else. In other words, money isn't intrinsically valuable. In order for something to be intrinsically valuable, it must be valuable in and of itself. And according to utilitarianism, utility is what is intrinsically valuable. Utility is good because it's utility, and its goodness doesn't come from my ability to exchange it for something else. Now, some utilitarians think that utility is pleasure. Others think that it is the satisfaction of desires. And others still think that it is the achievement of elements on a very special objective list. But at any rate, it should be clear that utility is not money. And in fact, I would even go so far as to say that anybody who tells you that utility is money is either deceiving you or they're just confused by utilitarianism, and they're most likely an economics professor. Now, second thing that all utilitarian theories have in common is that they're comparative. So think back to the story from the beginning of this discussion. To figure out how to spend my $150, I needed to figure out what my options were and how much intrinsic value they produced relative to one another. In the story, I considered two options: spending the money on Gretchen's AirPods or on bed nets through the Against Malaria Foundation. A third thing that all utilitarian things have in common is that they tell us to maximize intrinsic value. So the right action is the one that brings about at least as much net utility as all the other options in our option set. So I've mentioned net utility a couple times. Net utility refers to the amount of utility produced by an action minus the amount of disutility produced by that action. If utility is pleasure and disutility is pain, then the net utility of an action is determined by subtracting the amount of pain caused by an action from the amount of pleasure caused by that action. So in the story above, I determined that spending the money on bed nets was the option that would bring about the most net utility. Finally, utilitarian theories are impartial. So, although Gretchen is my friend, the only thing that determines whether an action is right is the amount of utility produced by that action in comparison to the amount of utility produced by the other options in that agent's option set. So if I can create more utility, more net utility by sending money overseas than by keeping it here, then I should do that. But if I can create more utility by keeping the money here rather than sending it overseas, then that is what I should do instead. All right. So those are some things that all utilitarian theories have in common. Let's now talk about some different versions of utilitarianism, beginning with that of Jeremy Bentham. Now, Bentham was born in 1748. He died in 1832, and he was a hedonistic utilitarian. Hedonistic utilitarians believe that utility is pleasure. They believe that pleasure is intrinsically valuable, and that we should perform the action that brings about the greatest balance, overall balance of pleasure over pain or suffering. Now, there's an enormous debate in the psychological and philosophical literature about the definition of pleasure, the definition of pain, the difference between pain and suffering, but I'm going to largely sidestep that debate here. Our ordinary conception of what pleasure, pain, and suffering are is going to work just fine. But it's worth noting that Bentham's conception of pleasure included a rich variety of experiences that spanned human consciousness. Pleasure, according to Bentham, include experiences of indulging great food, receiving a massage, and playing simple games. But it went beyond that, too. In chapters 5 of his 1789 book, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, Bentham also lists the pleasures of skill, the pleasures of piety, and the pleasures dependent on association. So in other words, profound experiences of mastering difficult skills, developing one's spirituality, and forming meaningful associations with others all count as pleasure, according to Bentham. Now, one question you might have is, are some kinds of pleasure more intrinsically valuable than other kinds of pleasure? According to Bentham, the answer is no. If watching TikTok videos produces more pleasure than reading philosophy papers, then Bentham, were he alive today, would say that watching TikTok videos is better than reading philosophy papers. And of course, watching TikTok videos probably will not produce more pleasure than reading really good philosophy papers, because scrolling through the endless loop of TikTok videos will get you hooked on instant gratification, destroying your ability to concentrate deeply for extended periods of time, turning you into a soulless husk of a person, forever cut off from the true, the good, and the beautiful. Now, that was an exaggeration, but my point is that the long-term and widespread effects of our actions, and not simply their immediate consequences, matter. So I use the phrase more net utility, but that phrase is vague. And in chapter 4 of Bentham's book, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, Bentham identified 6 criteria that determine the expected value of an action. There's the intensity and the duration of the pleasure expected to come from the action. So that's the first 2. There's how certain it is that pleasure will result from the action. There's how long it is expected to take for the pleasure to take effect. How likely it is for the pleasure to be followed by other pleasures. How likely it is for the pleasure to be followed by pains. And then finally, how many other sentient individuals are likely to be affected by the action. So sending bed nets to Malawi is better than buying Gretchen new headphones on most of those dimensions. It is expected to bring about a more intense pleasure, not getting malaria, versus having slightly better headphones that will last longer, since Gretchen will probably end up losing them, and it's going to affect more people. Given the Against Malaria Foundation's impressive level of transparency, I'm also actually more confident that giving them money will result in happiness from the Malawian children than I am that ordering headphones or Gretchen will make her happy. The headphones might get delayed or lost in the mail, or she might not even remember that she wants the headphones. That being said, the pleasure for Gretchen is more immediate than the pleasure for the children, because the bed nets, will cause the benefit of not getting malaria, and not getting malaria takes a long time to fully experience all the benefits of. So as I just discussed, Bentham believed that no kind of pleasure is intrinsically more valuable than any other kind of pleasure. Many utilitarians believe that Bentham was wrong, and it's not hard to see why. Isn't it better to be Socrates or Maya Angelou or Jen Psaki or some other great thinker than to be a pig rolling around in the mud? Even if the pig enjoys a life of uninterrupted muddy bliss, wouldn't it be better to experience the pinnacle of intellectual human achievement, even if you also have to experience sadness and pain at times? John Stuart Mill, who lived from 1806 to 1873, had something like this in mind when he wrote the following. And here I quote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides." According to Mill, the intellectual pleasures, poetry, philosophy, science, great art, and the like, are more valuable than the bodily pleasures. And if you are confused about this, well, just experience both pleasures, and then you'll come to see that the intellectual pleasures are superior. That's Mill's test. Now, one thing about which a lot of philosophers disagree with one another is whether to call Mill a hedonist. Remember that we called Bentham a hedonistic utilitarian because Bentham thought that pleasure is utility. Some philosophers say that Mill was not a hedonist because he thought that something other than the quantity of pleasure matters morally. Other philosophers call him a hedonist, but they distinguish between his hedonism and Bentham's hedonism by calling Mill a qualitative hedonist. What this means is that the amount of utility is produced by an action is a function of both the quantity and the quality of the pleasure produced by that action. Now, it doesn't matter to me whether or not you call Mill a hedonist, but it does matter that you understand the difference between Mill's account of utility and Bentham's. Now, another disagreement among philosophers has to do with whether the rightness of an action depends on the expected utility or on the actual utility of that action. Let's go back to the story from the beginning of this lecture. It's clear that the net expected utility of sending the $150 to the Against Malaria Foundation is higher than the the expected net utility of buying headphones for Gretchen. But let's suppose something. Suppose that my donation to the Against Malaria Foundation ends up saving the life of a child who then goes on to brutally murder 50 innocent people. If that were to happen, then it would seem that my donation had resulted in lower net utility than the alternative action of giving the money to Gretchen in the form of headphones. Now, if expected utility is what matters, then the right answer is to donate the money to the Against Malaria Foundation. When we're making the donation, we don't know what's going to happen with it, and it's unlikely that the scenario I just described where the child becomes a serial killer will materialize. But if actual utility is what matters, then the right action can actually be, under some strange circumstances, to buy the headphones for Gretchen. So let's take a step back. So far, I've been talking about utilitarianism as a theory of right action, rather than a theory of practical deliberation. And I've distinguished between Bentham and Mill's versions of utilitarianism as a theory of right action. But another question we need to ask is how, according to utilitarians, should we deliberate? In other words, what, according to utilitarians, is the best way of figuring out which actions we ought to perform? Now, the most obvious way to deliberate as a utilitarian is to just go through each action in our option set, calculate the net utility associated with that action, and pick the best one. But there's a lot of problems with that approach. One problem with the approach is that it's not always possible to do that. Now, Jeremy Bentham knew this, and his advice was to stick as close to the approach as possible. So here I'm going to quote again from an introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. And I quote, "It is not to be expected that this process of calculating utility should be strictly pursued previously to every moral judgment, or to every legislative or judicial operation. It may, however, be always kept in view, and as near as the process actually pursued on those occasions approaches to it, so near will such process approach to the character of an exact one." So that's from chapter 4, if you're interested. Now, Mill was less optimistic than Bentham. And he thought that when deliberating about what to do, we often don't have enough time to calculate utility. So it's not just that it's not always possible. It's that, like, maybe it would be possible, but it takes way too long. And instead, he thought that we should follow what are called subordinate principles. And here I'm going to quote Mill again from his book Utilitarianism. Here's the quote: "Whatever we adopt as the fundamental principle of morality, we require subordinate principles to apply it." End of the quote. Now, although, for example, lying is sometimes the right thing to do, it is extremely time-consuming to calculate the consequences of each lie we are considering telling. For this reason, it can be extremely useful for us to adopt a subordinate principle like the following: don't lie. Following that principle is going to save you a lot of time in your practical deliberations. But lying is the right thing to do, and telling a lie will lead to greater net utility. So, for example, if there's a group of Nazis who come to your door, they're knocking, and they're like, hey, are there any Jewish people hiding inside your house? And there are, in fact, some Jewish people hiding inside your house. It seems like lying to them, or at least deceiving them, is the right thing to do. A challenge for utilitarians, though, is to know when to follow the subordinate principles and when to deliberate using the principle of utility. Now, some people, including some textbook authors, think that the view that I just described should be called real utilitarianism. Such people are mistaken about that. And I'm going to conclude this video by explaining why. Real utilitarianism is the theory that the right action is the one that is required, or at least permitted, by a special set of rules. And these rules are the rules that, if followed, result in a society with the greatest net utility. In other words, these rules are at least as good as every other set of rules at producing a society with the greatest net utility. Real utilitarianism is thus a theory of right action that is a rival theory to the versions of utilitarianism that I have been developing in this video, including the version of utilitarianism that includes John Stuart Mill's subordinate principles. All utilitarians can use rules when engaging in practical deliberations. Rules, after all, are very useful tools. But real utilitarians take it a step further. What they claim is that what makes an action right is that it is required, or at least permitted, by the rules. They are thus denying the claim that what makes an action right is whether it results in more net utility than any other action in an agent's action set. So, while all utilitarians can accept that don't murder is a useful principle to use when deliberating about what to do, real utilitarians could take it a step further and say that one should never engage in murder, even when doing so will result in greater net utility. All right, so now we're going to talk about the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And as before, I'm going to start with a story. So one thing about me is that I love trains. And I was absolutely thrilled when last year, my friend Gretchen, you've been hearing about, agreed to join me on a cross-country trip from New York all the way to Los Angeles for my birthday. Now, unfortunately, my joy was short-lived due to Gretchen's behavior in the diner car, which I'm not going to go into. We were kicked off our train in St. Louis, and we were actually banned from all Amtrak trains for an entire year. Now, the morning after our banishment, I woke up early and I decided to go take a walk down by the tracks to at least snap some photos of trains. And I saw my old friend Judith standing on top of a bridge overlooking the tracks. A very large man was standing next to her. Now, on the tracks below, the train was heading towards 5 workers who had no way of avoiding the train's path. Underneath the bridge was a lever for a rail switch. And I watched in horror as Judith pushed the man off the bridge and onto the lever, killing him instantly and diverting the train onto an empty path, saving the 5 lives of the workers. I ran over, and when I reached Judith, I asked her if she thought she had done the right thing. And she said, yes, of course. The number of survivors is, because of me, 5 times what it otherwise would have been. Now, Judith had a point. Her action had brought about more net utility than any other action in her option set. There was no way to stop the train. The workers had no way of avoiding the train's path, and neither she nor anything else around her was heavy enough to have caused the lever to move. It was push the buff person or do nothing. But I couldn't help but feel that something was missing from her analysis. It seemed to me that there are some things that you just shouldn't do. For example, pushing an innocent person off a bridge to their death. Something that it seems like you just shouldn't do, even if doing that is going to bring about more net utility. Now, in this video, I'm going to be exploring a theory that, like many of us, would condemn Judith's choice. And in particular, I'm going to explore the theory of Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant was born in 1724, he died in 1804, and he was a philosopher who has a reputation today of being very difficult to understand. That being said, his basic insights are extremely compelling, and my hope is that I can explain them in such a way that you will understand where he was coming from. Now, let's start by talking about you. We're going to talk about what makes you special. Now, most of the universe is empty space. And against that backdrop, the existence of any life at all is awe-inspiring. You're not simply alive, though. You are an intelligent being who can experience your environment, you can perceive your environment's feature, and you can learn from that. You're not just intelligent, though. You're not just able to learn. You are among the minuscule percentage of intelligent beings capable of rationality. So when you feel afraid of, for example, a dog, you can notice that you're feeling fear. And you ask yourself, does this fear give me a good reason to avoid the dog? Or should I interact with the dog anyways? When your parents tell you that they would like you to be a doctor rather than a painter, you can ask yourself, does the fact that my parents want me to do something give me a good reason to do it? In other words, you aren't doomed to simply act in response to stimuli, in response to the desires that well up inside you, and in response to the commands that other people give you. You can ask whether those stimuli give you good reasons to act. And once you've decided that you do have a good reason to do something, you can do it. In other words, you can act for reasons. And that's not a trivial thing. Because due to the fact that you can act for reasons, you have a unique opportunity. You have the opportunity to be an author of the story of your life in a way that is unavailable to a barnacle, a beetle, or a bell pepper. So you're a creature who acts for reasons. But what are reasons? Well, reasons are not just idiosyncratic whims that pop into your head. Instead, reasons are universal. And to explore what this means, I'm going to give an example. Imagine that I'm hungry and that I don't have any money. I ask you if I can borrow $10 from you for a sandwich, and I promise to repay you. I have no intention of repaying you, but I know that the only way I can get you to give me the money to buy the sandwich is to promise to repay you. Now, philosopher Christine Korsgaard calls these kinds of promises repayment promises, but I'm going to call the ones where I lie false repayment promises. When I make a false repayment promise, I'm acting on the basis of a maxim like this one. If you need money from someone and you can't pay them back, you should promise to pay them back anyway. Now, the problem with this maxim is that it involves a contradiction. On the one hand, if everyone acted on the basis of that maxim, nobody would trust repayment promises. A world where that maxim is a universal law is not a world in which it makes any sense at all to make false repayment promises. On the other hand, you're trying to act on that maxim yourself. So here's the problem. When you make a false repayment promise, you are not acting in accordance with a maxim that you could will everyone to follow. Instead, you're making an exception for yourself. Look, lots of people do make exceptions for themselves, but you're capable of so much more than that. As a rational agent, you have the ability to look for reasons for your actions that are binding on all rational agents, and to chart your path on the basis of those reasons. But what do those reasons look like? Well, they look like this. Act only on a maxim which you are able to will as a universal law. In Kant's framework, that principle is called the categorical imperative. It is an imperative because it is a command. It is telling you to do something. It is categorical because it is an obligation that you have regardless of your goals or other purposes. Now, we can distinguish between categorical imperatives and hypothetical imperatives. So, here's an example of a hypothetical imperative. If you want to be a fast runner, you should train. The only time when that maxim has force is when you want to be a runner. But the categorical imperative differs from that because the categorical imperative is binding regardless of what your other aims are. Now, Kant gives several different formulations of the categorical imperative, and these are supposed to be equivalent to one another. In what follows, I'm not going to focus on the first version that I gave. Instead, what I'm going to focus on is a version called the Formula of Humanity. And I'm going to give you Course Guard's formulation of that. We should never act in such a way that we treat humanity, whether in ourselves or in others, as a means only, but always as an end in itself. Now, there are many ways that we can use one another as a means of bringing about our own ends. So when I sell you a sandwich, I'm using you as a means of getting money, and you are using me as a means of getting a sandwich. But I'm also treating you as an end in yourself, and you are treating me as an end in myself. You are a rational agent who is seeking the end of having a sandwich, and I am recognizing this fact about you when I'm inviting you to engage in a consensual transaction without force, coercion, or deception. If, on the other hand, I had simply robbed you or deceived you into giving me your money, I would be treating you simply as an obstacle between me and the money I want. I would be treating you merely as a means to the ends that I am seeking. So, finally, we're in a position to go back to the story and make sense of why Judith's action of pushing the large person off of the bridge seemed objectionable. When she pushed that large man onto the lever, killing him, she was using him as a means to bring about some other end, the end of saving the other 5 lives. But what's important is that she was using him only or merely as a means. She was treating him merely as an object that she could use to manipulate a lever, rather than an autonomous person, a rational agent with ends of his own. For this reason, Kant would say that what she had done was morally impermissible. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the story from the beginning. So let's go back to it. So imagine now, Judith and I, we're standing there on top of the bridge, we're talking, we're having a conversation, we're watching the tracks below us, and then all of a sudden, Gretchen appears out of nowhere. She had recovered her money that she was looking for. I don't remember exactly why she lost money, but she was out there trying to get money. And at this point, another train appears way off in the distance. And Judith notices that the 5 workers that we saw earlier, whose lives she had saved earlier, have now moved to the track that the first train had been redirected to. Now, if we didn't do anything, the train would have hit them. Gretchen, as was her tendency, complained that she was too tired to do anything. She mentioned something about shaking down people for money all day. I don't really know what she was talking about, but she communicated her intention to just sit there on the bridge and relax while the workers were killed. But Judith and I had other plans. We sprinted down the end of the bridge, went down to the path, went over to the lever, and with our combined strength, we were able to shift the lever. It had rusted shut and required a lot of force, and the 5 workers were saved. Now, Kant's Formula of Humanity can help us make sense of why saving the workers was a good thing to do. Letting them die would not have involved using them merely as a means, and for that reason, doing nothing wouldn't violate the categorical imperative. That being said, saving them was a way of fostering their ends. And fostering the ends of others is a way of treating them as ends in themselves. All 5 of them wanted to live, we can assume, and so saving their lives was a way of seeing them as ends in themselves and fostering those ends. And for this reason, we had what Kant calls an imperfect duty of beneficence to save their lives. Kant thought that we have significant discretion when it comes to discharging our imperfect duties of beneficence. But we shouldn't simply sit back, as Gretchen did, and let the workers die. Now, so far, I've been talking about a theory of right action rather than a theory of practical deliberation. And I'm going to conclude this part of the video by talking about deliberation. Now, the simplest way of deliberating about what to do, if you're Kantian, is to ask whether what you're proposing to do will involve using someone merely as a means. If the answer is yes, then deliberation done. You know that you shouldn't do it. It's really easy then to conclude that you shouldn't ever lie, you shouldn't cheat, shouldn't manipulate, you shouldn't murder others in the pursuit of your ends. Now, a challenge for the Kantian is that there are some situations, a lot of them, where an agent is not given a definitive answer about what to do. Now, when utilitarians are deciding between helping one person or helping someone else, they can figure out what to do by calculating which decision will lead to greater net utility, or by consulting their subordinate principles. Kantians don't believe that they are under any obligation to maximize overall net utility, though. They should still agree that it is morally good to foster the utility of others, but they believe that the way we discharge our imperfect duties of beneficence is up to our discretion. All right, so this is the final part of this video. And in this part, I'm going to be talking about Aristotelian virtue ethics. Now, as before, I'm going to start with a story about my friend Gretchen. Now, last week, Gretchen called me up on the phone to talk about an interview that she had just concluded with a local television station. Now, let me explain. I got to give you some background information. As I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about the golden rule, Gretchen sells essential oils. What I neglected to mention before was that Gretchen really sells essential oils. She's super serious about this. And she has, in a very short time, transformed what was essentially a hobby into a source of a 6-figure-a-year income. So I asked her how the interview had gone, and she was really excited. She reported that it had been a huge success, and I was happy for her. So later that night, I turned on my television set to watch the interview. But as it proceeded, I grew uncomfortable. Now, the reason why I grew uncomfortable was that Gretchen used every single question as an opportunity to boast distastefully about her own greatness. When asked about the difficulty of growing a business, she waxed poetic about the unimaginable struggles she faced that only someone with her unique quantity of grit could possibly have overcome. When asked about her innovations, the audience was treated to Gretchen's bold proclamations about her unmatched creativity and vision. It went on like that for the full 10-minute segment. The minute that the interview ended, my phone rang, and it was Gretchen. I thought it would be useful to be honest with her, so here's what I said. I said, look, Gretchen, there were some wonderful things about the interview. You were confident, and it was clear from your passion that you love what you do, and those are some of my favorite things about you. But the problem, I say this as a friend, is that you came across as quite arrogant. You chose to compare yourself to Michelangelo, Elizabeth Holmes, Steve Jobs, and Gandhi. Now, we got to have a conversation about Elizabeth Holmes sometimes because I don't think that example did what you thought it would do. But I think you should be less boastful next time. After an uncomfortable pause, she told me that she thought I was right. Next time, she said she would be more humble. The very next night, Gretchen was interviewed again. This time, a completely different Gretchen was on the screen in front of me. She indicated that she was not special, that anyone with a pulse and half a brain cell could have achieved her successes, and that any challenges she had faced along the way were symptoms of a deeply incompetent and unserious mind, rather than the difficulties of navigating a competitive marketplace. The boastful person from the night before had been replaced with someone whose mock modesty was equally obnoxious. Now, something went wrong in both those interviews. And the ethical theories I've presented so far aren't all that helpful at identifying what that is. It's unclear that what Gretchen was doing involved using someone merely as a means. So it would be a stretch to try to apply the Kantian categorical imperative. I don't know how to calculate the utilities associated with the choices Gretchen made. And while it would be possible to ask whether Gretchen would object to someone else exhibiting boastfulness or false modesty in front of her, such an application of the golden rule just doesn't get at the heart of what had gone wrong here. The bigger issue, it seems to me, has to do with Gretchen's character. According to the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, virtues are tendencies to behave and feel in ways that are appropriate. Also, virtues are intermediate between vices of excess and deficiency. For every sphere of action or feeling, we can identify a vice of excess, a vice of deficiency, and a virtuous mean. Now, what I just said was very abstract. And to make it easier to understand, let's think about applying it directly to the case of Gretchen. When we're giving interviews, we are asked to tell the truth about our accomplishments. And when we do that, there are two quite obvious ways that things can go wrong. We can be excessively boastful about our accomplishments, like Gretchen was in the first interview. Or we can be deficient in stating that our accomplishments are not that impressive. We can exhibit false modesty, like Gretchen was doing in the second video. Our goal should be to navigate between those vices of excess and deficiency and find the intermediate point, to find the mean, the virtuous mean, between vices of excess and deficiency. In Book 4 of the Kantian Ethics, Aristotle points this point as follows. The boastful man, then, is thought to be apt to claim the things that bring glory when he has not got them, or to claim more of them than he has. And the mock-modest man, on the other hand, to disclaim what he has, or belittle it, while the man who observes the mean is the one who calls a thing by its own name, being truthful, both in life and in word, owning to what he has, and neither more nor less. Now, it's a useful exercise to do an inventory of your own life and examine whether there are any areas where your character is vicious rather than virtuous. When you find that you are less than virtuous with respect to a particular sphere of action or feeling, you can, according to Aristotle, change your life for the better by changing your habits. If you find that, for example, you would like to make new friends, but you are afraid of rejection, you can work on becoming more courageous by making a point of talking to at least one new person every day until that becomes a habit. But be sure to not go too far in the other direction by becoming a rash person who plunges unthinkingly into risky situations. So, in the parts of this video about Kant, utilitarianism, and the golden rule, I was careful to distinguish between theories of right action and theories of practical deliberation. Some philosophers have attempted to fit Aristotle into this box. So, for example, Mark Timmons expresses virtue ethics as follows, and here I quote, "An action is right if and only if and because it is what a virtuous agent, acting in character, would not avoid doing in the circumstances under consideration." Now, if we accept that this is Aristotle's theory of right action, then the search for a theory of practical deliberation is quite straightforward. All we need to do is find procedures that get us to perform the actions that a virtuous agent would perform. That being said, I don't think that Aristotle fits as neatly into this box as the other theories that we've looked at. And to see why, let's take a deeper look at Aristotle's theory. In particular, we're going to look at what is known as the function argument, one of the most important arguments in all of Western philosophy. So let's start by talking about forks. In particular, what makes a fork a good fork? Well, a fork is sturdy and sharp enough to stab food, but it is not so sharp that it slices through your teeth or mouth when you try to use it. A fork should be heavy enough that you can tell when it's in your hand, but not so heavy that it's unwieldy. And a fork should be large enough to hold a substantial bite of food, but not so large that you have trouble fitting it into your mouth. In other words, to know what makes a fork a good fork, we need to know what forks are for. We need to know what a fork's function is. And when we think about the different parts of the body, we can do a similar thing. We think about the eye, the hand, the foot, the knees, whatever. We can ask what makes those things good instances of what they are. Given all that, wouldn't it be surprising if people didn't have a function? If we couldn't look at a person and ask the question, what are people for? What is their function? So let's talk about people now. What makes a person a good person? Well, to answer that question, we need to know what our function is. So there's a lot of different ways of understanding what Aristotle's asking when he asks what our function is. You might think, for example, that he's asking what our purpose is. And you might dismiss that question as a nonsensical, outdated, teleological metaphysical view. However, as I like to do, I'm going to borrow from one of my favorite living philosophers. I'm going to borrow from Christine Korsgaard. Now, according to Korsgaard, our function is how we humans do the things that we do, and in particular, how we lead our specific form of life. All living things have specific forms of life. So plants, for example. Plants do an enormous amount of things. They take in nutrients from the environment, they convert sunlight and carbon dioxide into energy and oxygen, and etc. Sentient animals build on this nutritive life that plants live by feeling pleasure and pain, forming friendships with other animals, and moving through their environments. That's how they do what they do. That's their form of life. And our form of life builds upon what our fellow creatures do by introducing rationality. You, as we said before in the discussion of Kant, are able to consider reasons for acting and act on the basis of those reasons. Reason, then, is how you do what you do. To quote Korsgaard, and here I quote, "Reason is the function of a human being because it is how we do what we do, which is to lead a specifically human form of life." Now, you shouldn't spend your whole life engaged in rational activity and nothing else. That would be a miserable way to live, and it wasn't Aristotle's point. The point, rather, is that rational activity is how we conduct our specific way of life. So you had better be good at it. Now, according to Aristotle, the virtues are qualities that make us good at performing our function. Specifically, virtues make us good at engaging in rational activity. So, for example, if you are too quick to anger, if you're irascible, you won't be able to control yourself well enough to rationally deliberate about how to respond to annoyances. You'll simply fly into a rage. On the other hand, if you are completely spiritless, you won't be able to deliberate effectively about annoyances either. You'll just go with the flow, do nothing. Nothing in you will even be moved enough to notice the annoyance and react to it. So you won't have any motivation to decide what to do. But if you have a good, gentle temper, depending on which translation of Aristotle you're using, you'll be able to deliberate about how best to respond to the annoyances and act in accordance with that decision. This is how the virtues make you good at your function. Now, there's always more to say about Aristotle, but I've said enough to show why he doesn't fit neatly into the theory of right action, theory of practical deliberation box that I've been using. Aristotle was concerned with helping us become good people, in the sense of becoming good at performing our function. His project wasn't to give us a moral rule like "thou shalt perform the actions that virtuous people perform." Although he was giving us a lot of great advice, he wasn't really giving us a theory of right action. However, he did provide us with many excellent tools for practical deliberation. Developing the virtues through training will make us better at deliberating, and we can use the doctrine of the mean to identify virtues. All you need to do is find a domain of action, find the vice of excess, the vice of deficiency, and the virtue in between. You can use this approach to explore the virtues that Aristotle talked about, and you can also use it to discover ones that he did not discuss.